Weeks have already passed since Ukraine penetrated into Russian territory, and to this day, Zelensky's troops are still around. As Putin would say, the Ukrainians have already liberated more than 1,300 square kilometers, or 745 square miles of territory in their advance towards the Russian city of Kursk. And as we told you in previous videos, they're advancing slowly but surely. The problem is that it's not clear that the strategy will work, because for now, the Russians seem to be looking the other way, specifically to the Donbass front, where the Ukrainians are being punished more than they should be. Now, the point is that the Kursk move was a surprise, and may not be the last. It's possible that the Ukrainians have plans to attempt a fresh action before the arrival of the Rasputitsa, or mud season. In other words, that phenomenon so typical in this region of the world in which the autumn rains and the first snowfalls turn the roads into impassable quagmires, paralyzing both troops and vehicles. The window of time is short, and any operation launched at this time would have to be aiming for a quick solution. The hypothesis that we could be facing an imminent new Ukrainian incursion is based on three premises. First, that Ukraine still retains significant resources in the rearguard. In a way, it comes down to the question that has become popular on social media: where are the leopards? Second, that the Kursk operation has been operationally successful, but perhaps more limited strategically. And third, the uncertainty generated by Biden's departure. Whatever happens in the United States, Ukraine needs a stronger position for what may lie ahead. Well, many possibilities are being considered here, from reinforcing the offensive in Kursk and taking it further to crossing the Dnieper to launch a major attack in Zaporizhia with the aim of isolating the Crimea. It is something that has been echoing strongly in recent days. The Russians themselves seem to expect something like this, and indeed on 26th of August they carried out one of their strongest attacks in months, with the launching of more than 100 missiles and 100 explosive drones. But what if we told you that there's another destination in the north that could be particularly juicy for Kyiv? Obviously, we're talking about Belarus. And no, we haven't gone crazy. Check it out.
Nearly a third of Belarus army deployed on Ukraine border, Lukashenko says.
According to some analysts, Ukraine could be considering invading Belarus. And pay attention, because Russian and Belarusian intelligence seems to be rather stirred up by this possibility. In fact, the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko speaks insistently of this possibility.
На белорусско-украинской границе более 120 тысяч войск Украины. Они держат на нашей границе.
And let's see. Of course, Ukraine has soldiers on the border with Belarus, but as many as 120,000. Lukashenko, I think you're exaggerating there. So far, no major movements have been detected in the area, but that was also true before the Kursk invasion. The Ukrainians have learned to do things very stealthily. So it's to be expected that Lukashenko is trying to draw attention to himself with this threat after witnessing the Kursk disaster. The guy is scared. After all, who is supposed to defend him? The tiny Belarusian armed forces? The all-powerful Russian dictator who has had a part of his country invaded for weeks by the poorest country in Europe and seems unable to react? We've already told you that it's not so easy for Russia to move tanks and troops, and even more difficult to do it quickly once these forces are already engaged on the front line. So yes, Lukashenko must be out of his mind with worry. However remote the possibility may be, it's surely enough to keep him awake at night. In fact, in an August interview, he launched messages that seem aimed at getting Putin's attention. Messages like this.
Президента Путина ни с кем нет таких отношений, как с Беларусью. Как некоторые говорят, мы русские люди. Чем мы отличаемся, белорусы, от русских? А ничем. Я когда-то в шутку говорил, белорусы — те же русские со знаком качества. Ну так, в шутку. Ничем мы не отличаемся.
So, in a nutshell, Belarusians are Russians. Therefore, Moscow must get involved if the Ukrainians do something to us. Lukashenko's fear following the Kursk invasion is palpable. The Belarusian dictator is seeing that the Ukrainians are stronger than they seemed, that they have unused reserves, and that he knows what he's done. It's obvious that Lukashenko knows that the Ukrainians have it in for him, and that they will want to settle the score at some point. Because, don't you remember? It's been a long time since then, but it's worth remembering. In the first months, the Belarusians were a key element in Putin's ability to invade Ukraine and even reach the suburbs of Kyiv. Many Russian troops entered from Belarusian localities, such as Bolshoi Bokov, Narulia, and Koiniki, before they were sanctified by Saint Javelin and company. When Ukraine looked done for, it was all thanks to Belarus. What's more, do you remember that Russia took Chernobyl in the first days of the invasion? Well, to do so, they had also entered from Belarus. And not only that, more than 700 Iskander missiles have been launched from Lukashenko's country, and given its proximity to Kyiv, all that was key for installing a lot of fear and terror into the inhabitants of the Ukrainian capital. For months, the Belarusian dictator gave Putin carte blanche to use the country as he pleased, and it's not so different today. The Russians can station any troops they want there, and use the railway network to transport military equipment, among many other things. On top of that, following numerous Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries, Lukashenko has made his country's refineries, such as Novopolotsk and Mozyr, available to Putin. And that means that thousands of pieces of Russian military equipment have been able to continue to wage war, thanks precisely to Belarus. And as if that were not enough, Putin's lapdog has also given us headlines like this.
Russia's nuclear weapons are now in Belarus. The move sends a clear political message, but some experts downplay its military significance.
Come on, Ukraine has plenty of reasons to want revenge, but obviously, this war is about victory, not revenge. Do Lukashenko's fears of a Ukrainian invasion make sense? And I don't mean whether or not it would be justified, which, as you can see, yes, it would be quite reasonable. I mean, whether Ukraine could really gain any strategic advantage in the war with such a move. Does Ukraine really have the capacity to do so? And if they did, what might Zelensky be hoping for with such a move? Would they have the support of the West? Or conversely, would meddling in a country other than Russia be a hard red line? Well, we're going to tell you all this and more in this video, so stay tuned.
A rose-lined path?
To begin with, Belarus is not Russia, no matter how much Lukashenko likes to say otherwise. And now I'm referring to military issues. You see, although it's an ex-Soviet dictatorship, and many of you may think that this is equivalent to having a large and powerful military, in this case, the reality is totally different. The Belarusians have a ramshackle armed forces, full of antiquities, and with fewer than 50,000 professional troops. Of these, it's estimated that only 17,000 are currently trained and ready for deployment. And that is being generous, because many sources reduce this estimate even further, to a range of between 6,000 and 10,000 troops. To give you an idea, some sources suggest that Ukraine could be using between 10,000 and 20,000 troops in its military operation in Kursk. So you can see the problems the Belarusians could have in defending themselves. Not to mention that they don't have modern equipment, let alone Western equipment, as the Ukrainians might have, to carry out such a possible operation. The Belarusian military is clearly underfunded. Over the last decade, its military budget has hovered around $700 million per year. To make matters worse, following the outbreak of the war, Belarus handed over a lot of its useful equipment to the Russian army. Of what they have left, we're talking about T-72 tanks, BTR-82A transport vehicles, and some Sukhoi Su-30 fighters. Their Akatsiya self-propelled howitzers, or Tochka-U short-range ballistic missiles, would be no match against HIMARS, let alone ATACMS missiles. So adding up all the variables, it could be said that the Belarusians lack sufficient capability to defend their vast territory, which is slightly smaller than that of the United Kingdom. Their most advanced defense basically relies on a few S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems. Lukashenko has never been afraid of an outside invasion, except perhaps one by Russia, from which he felt he could not defend himself. Therefore, in this light, he quickly understood that he had to prioritize two things: reinforcing the repressive police state to stop any internal attempt to overthrow his government, and external action. He even went so far as to attempt a rapprochement with Europe before throwing himself back into Putin's arms. For its part, Russia's idea has always been to keep a tight rein on its neighbor, which is clearly a puppet state of Moscow. And to do this, they've always tried to prevent them from developing strong armed forces. Their protection had to be first and foremost Moscow. But now, not surprisingly, the war in Ukraine has upset all the balances of power in this region. The result is that this strategy could become a real headache for the Russians and for Lukashenko. If the Ukrainians invaded Belarus, how could they defend themselves? What could they expect from Russia given the current situation? Everything indicates that Ukraine could enter its northern neighbor, even with the troops it currently has stationed on the border with Belarus. Right beside Belarus, there are brigades such as the 13th Jaeger Brigade, the 120th Defense Brigade, and the 49th Artillery Brigade. And what's more, Lukashenko's regime is terribly unpopular in his own country. So what does this mean? Well, maybe the Ukrainians wouldn't even need to fight. They could be seen as liberators by most of the population, and that could force a coup d'etat, or a popular uprising that would end with Lukashenko in exile sooner rather than later. And okay, I know what some of you are wondering. If Ukraine enters Belarus, couldn't Russia send more troops there? Well, let's see. 80% of all troops and almost all advanced military systems are on the front with Ukraine. And now, to cap it all, what little moderately advanced resources Russia has left are moving north to defend Kursk. In other words, if the Ukrainians wanted to land a final blow to the situation and completely wreck Moscow's schemes, an incursion, major or minor, into Belarus would make perfect sense now. Or very soon. That at least is what some leading military analysts are pointing to. However, beyond whether or not Ukraine could score a big victory in Belarus, and who knows, maybe even topple Lukashenko, the big question is another one. Why would they do this? What would they hope to achieve? Would it make sense? Well, to find out, we're going to focus on two possible motives. The first we've already mentioned: revenge. It's possible that Zelensky wants revenge for everything we told you about at the beginning of the video. He has plenty of motives. Even so, if revenge was what he was after, he would have launched the attack earlier. In fact, doing so now after the events of Kursk has advantages, because the Russians might not devote as much effort to helping Belarus, but it also has disadvantages. The Belarusian troops, though few and ill-prepared, are now on alert. The Russians, on the other hand, were not prepared for the possibility of a Ukrainian invasion, but the Belarusians now have it in their heads that this possibility is real, and that could be decisive when it comes to making a final decision in Kyiv. Now, if revenge is not the main motive, another possibility would be prevention. Ukraine could preemptively attack Belarus to prevent them from making a first strike. But how could Belarus risk a first strike against the Ukrainians in this situation? Aren't you saying that they don't have a proper army? Well, obviously we aren't talking about the Belarusians invading northern Ukraine. However, Russia could be preparing something in this area to demoralize the Ukrainians, because they are furious about the Kursk operation. Now, how could they do that? Well, some analysts believe that Moscow could be preparing an attack in Belarus to pin on Ukraine and force Lukashenko to enter the war, even with what little he has, or even by mobilizing his more than 200,000 reservists.
Signs of Russian provocation being prepared in Belarus to drag Minsk into war.
It's an idea that has been talked about since April, but one that could now gain more traction than ever. Still, be careful. It's not at all clear that Lukashenko would get into this mess, even if Russia prepared some false flag action in his country. Among other reasons, because only 10% of Belarusians currently support this idea. Let me stress again, both the Belarusian regime and the war in Ukraine are extremely unpopular in the country. But okay, a moment ago, we told you that Zelensky might have two motives for attacking Belarus. Well, actually, there aren't only two. There's one more. Negotiation and political warfare. Pay attention to this one. Zelensky knows that if the Ukrainians try to repeat Kursk in Belarus, Lukashenko would probably seek the survival of his regime through negotiation at all costs. And in this, VisualPolitik viewers, there could be two scenarios: that the regime would fall, or that the regime would break with Moscow. In either outcome, that would be a huge setback for Putin, a political blow from which he might not be able to recover. Losing its great ally, losing a satellite state as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, would be a terrible thing for his image and power within Russia. In itself, such an action could quickly push the Kremlin to the negotiating table. And that's not all. The message that would be sent would also be very clear. If you are on Putin's side and help him, it's going to end up very badly for you. Not only will you become an international pariah, but on top of that, sooner or later, you will fall because Moscow is not able to protect you. If successful, this operation could be a masterful move. And yes, no doubt, these three reasons that we have given may make a lot of sense, and everything indicates that Ukraine could easily achieve them. But take note, if Kyiv invades another country that is not Russia, the challenges and dilemmas inside, and particularly outside Ukraine, could be enormous. Now, what exactly are we talking about? Well, pay close attention.
A high-risk operation.
The first difficulty Ukraine might encounter if it were to seek to intervene in Belarus is the possible lack of international support. For whatever reasons, invading Belarus, a country that, as of today, is not attacking Ukraine, could have different implications than the Kursk operation, so the reaction would be different. Ukraine could go from being the victim of savage criminal invasion to becoming a country that also invades others. But obviously, on the other hand, this action could have significant benefits for the West. For one thing, it would strengthen the security of the Baltics and remove Russia from the heart of Europe. Without Belarus and Ukraine, Russia would be completely out of Europe. What's more, Brussels would be relieved of a regime that has been more than annoying in recent years. Don't forget how we saw in May 2021 the Belarusians technically ordering the hijacking of a Ryanair plane covering the Athens-Vilnius route because political activist Roman Protasevich and his partner were on board and they wanted to arrest him. They did so, not surprisingly, by bypassing all aviation laws, threatening a commercial airliner with fighter jets, and violating the integrity of citizens protected by Europe. Of course, supporting an invasion is not the same as applauding from the sidelines. Neutral countries, let alone the pro-Russians, could raise their own flag. You see, we told you so. They are a threat, a danger, a violent country. We were right. Obviously, as far as arguments go, it is quite stupid, but I'm convinced that we would hear that or similar things from more than one person. Even from some of those internet celebrities who have taken advantage of the war to get a piece of the publicity pie. But above all, the main problem is where it always lies. Cornering Putin too much could entail a major danger. Don't forget that we are talking about, let me stress it, a nuclear power. It's the very same reason why the Biden administration in Washington remains reluctant to give Ukraine a free hand with its long-range weapons. Now, the other big question that we haven't yet answered, at least not directly, is does Ukraine have the military capability to open and maintain a new front in Belarus? Well, here, there are opinions for all tastes.
Out in the open and on the move, in Russia's Kursk Oblast, Ukrainian forces are vulnerable.
Things get interesting. At first glance, yes, Kyiv has a clear military advantage, especially since it has direct access to the Western military inventory. Besides, as we already told you, the Belarusian army is, well, a bit of a joke. And to top it off, Russia is not exactly in a position to help either. The problem is that Ukraine is already at the limit of its capabilities. Currently, it not only has open fronts in the east and south of its own territory, but also in the northeast inside Russia in Kursk. The Ukrainians are not exactly flush with ammunition or manpower. How on earth could they afford to open another front? And more importantly, keep it. In all honesty, the risk is enormous. Ukraine could become enormously vulnerable if it opens too many fronts at the same time before closing others. Unless, of course, Zelensky has an ace up its sleeve. Check it out. As we've already told you, local support within Belarus could give Ukraine a totally unexpected advantage if it wanted to damage the Minsk region. It's no secret that the Lukashenko regime is maintained by his iron fist, and above all, by Moscow's support. In fact, his actual popular support may not be much more than 30%. And there are more than enough indications that Ukrainian forces could receive significant local support if they were to attempt this operation. A Ukrainian intervention in this country could drum up a lot of domestic support if well planned and communicated. If Ukrainians plan to liberate Belarusians from that regime, many might even embrace that possibility. Despite the strong political repression, there is still an underground network of opposition groups in Belarus that could facilitate the possible invasion by sabotaging its own government security forces. And not only that, mass protests that we already saw in 2020 and 2021 could be rekindled, and many may even want to enlist in the invading forces.
In case Ukraine fails in this war, there will be no opportunity for Belarusians to get rid of Lukashenko.
So you see, it sounds crazy, but a likely crazy after all. This war has given us crazier surprises in the 2.5 years of fighting and bombing, so who knows? Of course, this is just a possibility that some military analyses that have been brought to our attention are pointing to. We can't tell you exactly how likely it is, but one thing is clear. If successful, it would be a formidable move. However, it would have to be done very quickly, so that Moscow wouldn't even have time to breathe, and to avoid Rasputitsa, the mud season, or at least swift enough to be able to tell them, okay, that's enough, shall we negotiate? Anyway, in the coming weeks, we'll see if there really is a basis for any new moves on the part of Ukraine, or instead, as other analyses point out, the situation in terms of attrition is already too difficult to try new incursions. For the moment, we'll turn the questions over to you. Do you think Ukraine may be considering invading Belarus soon? If they do, how far do you think they could go? Will they be able to topple Lukashenko along with local help? Leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And of course, if you like this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. That way, you won't miss any news. Thank you so very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.